Okay, well, guys, I saw that at the last video it got cut off a bit from doing the tracing, but what I did was I basically traced over it with pen. I used pen so it would show it better where I had already traced because it's like a red pen, but it has a hard tip on it. And then you can see very lightly. This is with a bit of a too light of a pencil, but you can see sort of there that I traced it. If you use the darker B pencil, like a 6 or 8, it would be even darker. That way, when you go back to ink it, if you made a mistake on the whole thing, you don't have to redraw it. You just use those lines to start over again, basically. All right, let's talk a bit about brushes. So we went into the nibs. We did repairing this way. We talked about scraping away with a little bit of a X-Acto knife, and then we did different styles. I showed you, this shows you that patch afterwards. It looks like you can't even really see it very much because it worked pretty well. Let's talk about using brushes. So, like I said before, a round brush is probably fine, the best one. You could use flats and things if you like them. Another good thing that can be very helpful is actually Q-tips. And the way you're going to do all this is, if you do it through inking with brush washes, is that you have your black ink in one of your wells, and then you want to add a lot of water to the different ones to get grays. The ink is waterproof, but that doesn't mean you can't add water to it. It means that once it dries, more water won't make it pick up off the page. So that's why you want it to be waterproof, because if you have really light washes and you want to add darker ones over the top, you don't want them to keep lifting off the page. So I would recommend you trying out getting different tones before, if you decide to do it this way. You have your black out of the bottle, and you can kind of play with how much water. I was just adding water to that, how much you need to be able to get something that's kind of in the middle that's still a little dark. So add more water. That's kind of getting close, still a little on the dark side. The brush is losing some of its hairs. One thing I want to talk to you about with inking too, and it was inside one of the documents I gave you though, is that you want to keep the edge wet. So if you want something to be an even tone, you need to keep the edge wet so you can keep moving the ink down the page or into the shape you want. As soon as it dries up, like that is already starting to dry, if I go back over it, there'll be a line that shows. Can you see that? So if you keep the edge wet, you can move it. If not, there will be a little line that will show. No matter if I have it or not, like try to cover it, it'll still show. So you want to pay attention to how wet the edges are that you're working with. Just like with the nibs, you can get a lot of texture with ink, depending on how you apply the ink. You can use hatching, cross hatching, and dry brushing. So if you get your brush dry and you just kind of get rid of the excess on there, this is called dry brushing. When you get the white of the paper sort of showing through. See, you can have bits of white showing through. If you have a portrait where you want a lot of black to be, so you would use your brush and you're still using your nibs together in conjunction with each other, you do not necessarily want to ink it like a big black mark that's solid where the shadow is. You'd be better off, because when you try to draw over the top of it with your ink lines later, say this was the black ink that you're going to do, I'm doing it red so you can see, no matter how many lines you put there, you would still see that edge, that really dark edge of the black ink. But if you wanted to do that type of an effect, what you would do is dry brush it, because it's not dry enough yet. If you do a shape that has a, oh, still not dry enough. If you do dry brushing for your shapes, keeping the edge sort of not so dark and crisp, but sort of like that. When you come in with ink, if you came in with ink that was black, it would actually be able to be disguised, because when you went like that, it wouldn't be such a sharp line. When you do your next lines, you can really fade it together. I'm doing it in blue so you can see what I'm talking about. If I kept adding it, see, eventually they would kind of fade together right here. Even though it's a different color, they're feathered together because I have a dry brush edge rather than a hard edge from a big shape of black. So this seems like a scary way to do your portrait, but if you try out a lot of try it with the brush and mess around with it, after you get used to it, you might actually find that you like it better, because you can have a really expressive quality to it. But you don't want to have it all be solid black like that, because that'll get funny. So you're going to want to use probably some washes of grays. And what I do when I do washes in different tones of gray, I have my palette, and I'm kind of like leapfrogging into the different palette wells to get different amounts of gray in each one. So I have like black here, darker, almost still black. Then I'm getting like a lighter grays. You have to make sure you clean your brush off, otherwise. See what I'm saying? I'm going to make a really light one over here by adding, you can probably hear my kids in the background, they're crying, by adding water into it. So if I want a really light one, I have to have a lot of water. I can get some really light washes. Okay, so you can get different tones. You want to play with how to get the tones. If you use thicker paper, it will work better, it won't buckle so much. But you can see by adding different amounts of water, I can get from black to like real dark grays to really light grays. This paper, because it's thinner, it's getting kind of funny where the way it's blooming in the paper. But once it dries, this isn't dry yet, you could come back and you can add, let's see, maybe it's long enough now, I'll show you. You can add, when you add a lighter tone or a darker tone over it, watch, it won't pick up. Yeah, see, it's working. So you can work this way, preserve the white of your paper, because the whitest white you can get is your paper. And then you can work from light to dark this way if it's thicker paper, because if it's thin paper, you'll get too much water and it'll get all balled up and start breaking down on you. But if it's thicker paper, you could do your lights and then work successively to dark, as long as you're paying attention to not having too hard of edges anywhere, like I was talking about, messing it up. You can kind of build it up that way and it'll look really nice. Or the other way around, but I think usually it's easiest to work from lighter washes to darker. That way you kind of establish where the very light white parts are, then the lightest parts, and then the shadow part you can put a wash on that's kind of middle gray maybe, and then keep adding depth to the shadows that way, which can work really well. So hopefully this is making sense to you. If you have questions, please ask them, because it's kind of going to become specific to your project itself as part of the thing. And you definitely need to do a lot of experimenting with the nibs. And really, honestly, a combination of the two can work quite well too. You do a lot of this tones with this, and then some of the details with the nib work in some of the spots, like the eyes, maybe hair, particular parts of hair. But big hair parts, you actually want to use more like values, and do a big value swatch, and then maybe add a little texture into it, rather than trying to you wouldn't want to try to draw every little hair, basically, is what I'm saying. I wanted to show you too, and I kind of just did, but it wasn't very clear because the paper was covered, is you can do some effects, or actually I say you should be careful of the fact that if you don't let it dry, it's an effect you could use to your benefit, but you have to use it very carefully because it can get out of control really quickly, is if the paper is still wet in some spot and it's a lighter tone, if you try to brush into it and cover it, you think, oh, okay, just cover it with something. What happens is called wet into wet. See how it's blooming into it? It's because the ink continues to travel through the water and it goes further out. It gives you this wet into wet effect, which could be kind of cool for certain types of textures. They use a lot in watercolor painting. And maybe depending on what you're doing, it could help you with a few things, but overall it probably mess you up a lot. So you want to make sure you're paying attention to how dry the paper is where you're adding, especially if you're trying to do dry brushing techniques. You could really have barely any ink on there and get some really light grays and get some really interesting tones that work for you really well, like almost like shading with charcoal. But you want to pay attention to the wetness of the edge and how wet it is if you're trying to apply pigment ink over other areas that already have ink, because you could really mess yourself up. If you need to speed up with a hairdryer, you could, but be careful if you put the hairdryer too close, you can actually push the ink a little bit. So letting it dry naturally, or if you hairdry it, don't have it like right up here, pull it back a ways to do that. Alright? If you have questions, please comment or ask questions in the question answer board because I really want to help you. That's going to depend on your individual portraits. So please post pictures of your progress as well, and figure out an inking style that works for what you're going, or your idea, and try out a couple different ways, and then do some test sheets like this so you can play with it. Maybe even copy over part of your picture, like an eye or something, or hair, and try to replicate what you're looking for on an extra piece of paper, because you're going to spend a lot of time drawing it in pencil graphite. You don't want to mess it all up without doing a little practice. And you're going to be worried about it, but like I said, there's ways to transfer it. Also, when drawing pencil, we talked about this a few times, but make sure you don't get too dark, because otherwise it'll be hard to erase. Okay, and don't try to erase it when it's wet, okay, because you'll rip it up. So those are some things to think about. I hope you guys are doing well, and we'll talk soon.